Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Long Valley studio in Washington, Utah. If you weren't already aware of this, I want you to know that this show serves a dual purpose. First, it provides a safe space for victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault to share their experiences to facilitate healing. Secondly, it educates listeners on the principles of a trauma-informed response to foster effective advocacy and positive action. The goals of this podcast are to promote healing and provide a furthering of your knowledge about the prevalence of rape culture in our communities and how being trauma-informed is a powerful step in reducing that prevalence. Thank you for joining me today. I'm glad you're here. This is episode 135, and it's a true pleasure to introduce my guests this week. Yes, for a second week in a row, I did say guests, as I am pod sharing this week and have the honor of introducing to you the hosts of the What They Don't Say podcast, Lauren King and Shannon Porter. If you haven't had the pleasance of listening to their show, I strongly encourage you to take the time to subscribe and start listening to their powerful podcast. They're not only insightful, but educational, purposeful, and sometimes downright hilarious. In fact, those are the reasons I wanted them on my show. Here they are with me in a great conversation, Lauren and Shannon.
Hey, SAS listeners, it is an exciting day for me because I am sitting here with Lauren King and Shannon Porter, the hosts of What They Don't Say, Sexual Assault and Everything is the full title of their podcast. And we're doing a pod share today. So ladies, Lauren, Shannon, thank you so much for being here with me.
Yeah, of course. We're happy to be here.
It's going to be tricky because I don't use video and I know you guys do. The one who just spoke was Lauren. And so if you want to get her voice in your head so you know when she's talking, and Shannon hasn't said much.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to meet you via this podcast.
Do we sound similar? Our voices?
You do. You sound very similar, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we are related.
Yeah, and that's an interesting aspect of your podcast, and one of the things I was eventually going to want to get into. Let's just start out with some background from both of you, and then I'll give your listeners some background about me. I'll let Shannon talk first because she hasn't said much. So Shannon, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I think that's one of my more fun facts because usually when I meet people, they say, "Oh, I've never met anybody from New Mexico." So there I am being representative of my people. So yeah, I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and really I felt like a lot of my life was spent in an ice rink. I was a figure skater for over 16 years. It was my dream, my love. I thought I was going to do it forever, and ultimately I ended up moving to Colorado Springs to do it full time. Skating always came first. It was skating before friends, before school, before social life, anything like that. Whenever I start telling like who I am, my inclination is to start talking about all the trauma I've experienced. But I don't know if that's actually what you're looking for. So I will skip some of it, maybe.
I think whatever you talk about is absolutely wonderful. And I'm just going to tell my audience right now, Lauren and Shannon and I have been talking before I just did this short little intro for about 30 minutes. And we've gone over a whole lot of things. So this isn't one of them, though. And it's an interesting fact that you start talking about who you are and what your past is. And you have this tendency to lean towards the trauma. And
Yeah.
I'm guessing when you said that, correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of your trauma is skating related trauma?
Actually, no.
No?
I think
Okay.
that I unscathed. I don't think I've ever had any serious eating disorders. I think that I definitely lived under a lot of stress and pressure every day. I was skating all day, every day, 6 days a week for over 16 years of my life. I wanted to go to the Olympics. Both my parents are Olympians, so
Wow.
I wanted to fulfill that dream goal. And then everything really stopped for me when I was assaulted because all of a sudden I had no capacity to be an athlete. I didn't have capacity to brush my teeth, let alone try to be an Olympic athlete. That's just not possible. And so I really had to shift what I wanted my life to look like. And I went to college and just wanted to be a normal person. And so a lot of who I am and how I got here now is just trying to figure out who I was outside of a sport that was, I think, taken away from me by someone assaulting me. But I attended the University of Colorado Boulder and I absolutely loved it. I loved being a normal person. I loved that I went from being so stressed physically and emotionally each day with skating to being a student. And my biggest stress was studying for an exam. I just felt this big weight lifted off of my shoulders almost when I quit, even though it was outside of what I had really wanted. But I studied marketing and I met a great group of people. I think my people that I'll be friends with for hopefully the rest of my life. And currently I'm living in Denver. That's how I got here.
Nice.
And I'm just going to interject real quickly. A lot of my audience already knows this, but I lived in Boulder for a while. I have a huge love in my heart for Boulder and Boulder County in general. And my law enforcement career was in Lafayette, which is 12 miles east of Boulder. Much of what I did as a cop happened in Boulder because that's where the Boulder County Justice Center is. That's where the courts were. That's where all the DUI stuff that had follow-up and hearings and stuff was, and the jail was there. And so I spent a lot of time still, even though I was in Lafayette working, I was in Boulder a lot. So I have a love for Boulder. And so when you said that, and it reminded me from when we talked a couple of months ago that Boulder is home, I have pangs in my heart to go back to Boulder. I love that area.
It's beautiful. Like I couldn't believe that I got to go to college there. Every time I go back, it still very much feels like a college town for me. But when I drive and I see the Flatirons, I just think, wow, I can't believe that I got to literally see these every single day as I was on campus. It was awesome.
Yeah, and it is. It's breathtaking. And if any of your audience or my audience have no idea what the Flatirons are, look it up in Boulder, Colorado, because there's beautiful pictures of Flatirons. Chautauqua Park, I miss that place. I miss so much. It's a great little summary that you've given us, and I appreciate that, but it's leading to all these kinds of questions that are going to come up later as we talk. So
just my little word vomit.
I love that. That's good. Word vomit. Blah.
Dave, you're so funny.
I'm hilarious. Watch me edit that out.
I mean, you shouldn't.
Lauren's covering her mouth and just laughing. She said, like, "You're nuts." This is a side of me that I don't think my audience has ever heard from me before. But Lauren, talk to us about you.
Yeah, it's my turn to word vomit. Let's see. I grew up in San Francisco Bay Area. Interesting
Lucky.
place to grow up.
Well, I love Albuquerque. I love Boulder, and San Francisco Bay Area is one of my favorite places to visit.
Yeah.
I interrupted you. Keep going. I'll be quiet.
Okay. So yeah, I grew up Northern California, Bay Area. I was not a figure skater for most of my life, but I did start figure skating before Shannon did. I just didn't keep it up.
Oh.
So that's my fun fact about that. I would say that my life was pretty defined by my love for environmentalism. I decided at 8 years old that I wanted to be in the environmental field. I discovered plastic pollution and I decided, wow, humanity sucks and I need to do something about it. Yeah, a lot of my life was really focused on that. Even in middle school and high school, I'd always do environmental science research projects and things like that. And I always knew that when I got into college, I wanted to focus on that. But then I also was a competitive soccer player, played a lot of sports. I feel like it was kind of a typical high school life within that. Shannon mentioned we have a lot of athletes in our family. So there's a lot of there's a competitive nature in our blood for sure. We all played a lot of sports. That was a big part of who I was. And I continued that through college. I was on my college's climbing team, which was really fun and a really different experience. So that was also something that has defined a lot of my life and just like outdoor sports in general and skiing and things like that. So after I graduated undergrad, I kind of knew I wanted to be in a space where I just had a lot of access to the outdoors, but could also just further my education because the environmental field's super competitive. It's super hard to get into this space. So that's when I moved out to Boulder and I attended CU and I got my master's in environmental policy. I decided to stay. I just graduated this past year from that. Man, I don't know what else to say. This is like, this is hard.
It is hard. And I struggle with it every time somebody says, tell us about your background. And where do I start?
Right.
Yeah. We touched earlier on the fact that Lauren, you and Shannon are related. So explain that to the audience.
We are cousins. My father and Shannon's mother are siblings.
And my mom is one of three. So we have another uncle and another set of cousins. And my mom is the oldest one. And I would say viciously different than the other two, than her brothers. Yeah.
But whenever the cousins get together, Shannon's in charge because her mom's the oldest.
That would be funny. No, so everybody else grew up in the Bay Area, and I was the only cousin that didn't grow up there. So I felt like they all bonded, and then I would come in and be the weird one from New Mexico. And now, since we've gotten older, things have shifted a bit, especially getting to spend a year living in the same place as Lauren, because her grad school overlapped with my undergrad, my senior year. And so that was like really, really awesome to be in the same place as a family member. I felt like a sense of FOMO, like fear of missing out with the family a lot. And so that was kind of a way to heal that very, not a big traumatic thing. Okay. Just a very small thing.
And it's interesting that you grew up in Albuquerque and the rest of the family grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. They couldn't even spell Albuquerque.
Yeah, no, I bet you still couldn't, Lauren.
I bet that I could, okay?
Okay, well, do it on the air. We're waiting.
Here you go.
Oh, this is a lot of pressure. I want to like write it down. I need to like see it. That's how you know it's right,
Well,
I forced myself to memorize how to spell Albuquerque. New Mexico was my backyard growing up in El Paso.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There you
So
go.
I spent a lot of time in New Mexico. The Bible camp I grew up in was in Glenwood, New Mexico.
Wow.
Southwest Bible Camp. And a lot of the people that came to Southwest Bible Camp were from the same evangelical assembly in Albuquerque that we were from in El Paso. So I knew a lot of people in Albuquerque. And it's ALBUQUERQUE.
Ah, good job, Dave. That was correct.
Yeah, that's good. I don't think I would have gotten that right. You're right.
I saved you.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and whatever traumatic events you choose to share or not share?
I would be happy to. It was a traumatic experience growing up. Even though I had that church background, my father was very abusive. I grew up physically abused and emotionally abused quite a bit. And it wasn't just me, although I was the third child of four. My younger sibling, who recently passed away just a little over a year ago, had cerebral palsy. He was ambulatory, but he wasn't high functioning and had probably about a second or third grade educational processing cognitively. My next sibling up was my sister, who is alive, and I'm very, very close to her. And she is in the Phoenix area, in a small town outside of Phoenix, Apache Junction. And she and I are really close. We talk almost every day. Mm-hmm. The oldest sibling was my brother Tom, and he passed away almost 5 years ago now. Mm-hmm. Very suddenly. It was a strange death. He was just laying in bed watching TV with his wife and jerked, and she said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "I don't know," and then died.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was just very sudden. I think when that happened, he was 68. After high school, I graduated from Eastwood High and went right to Baylor University and had this aspiration of being an opera singer. I was a music major with voice performance emphasis. I quit after 2.5 years before they kicked me out. And the reason they were about to kick me out is because I was a great singer. I still consider myself a pretty good singer, but I suck as a musician in terms of everything else. I didn't catch on with the theory. I hated the history. All the extraneous courses that go along with being a music major weren't my bailiwick. Just singing was.
Come on, Dave, prove it.
Prove it. I'll fall back on the fact of something I told you two before we started the recording is that I'm not feeling great. I feel this cold coming on.
I believe
you don't have to make excuses. I'm just hearing excuses.
Well, it's also hard to sing for me. It's hard to sing a cappella. So.
That's fair.
And if you're going to ask me to sing, I'm going to ask you to tell me all about Muir Woods since you're an environmentalist. So you had to have spent time in Muir Woods.
I actually didn't.
Oh my gosh.
But I've been there. I've been there.
Okay. Well, it's something that I think anybody that lives in that area or visits that area has to go see. It is phenomenal. It's almost as good as the Flatirons.
It's pretty beautiful. I just spent a lot of time going south of San Francisco. I didn't spend a lot of time exploring north of the Golden Gate Bridge, honestly, until I got like a little bit older.
Okay. Well, and back to me after I dropped out of Baylor. Sorry, I'm just going to jump right back into Dave. I moved back home to El Paso, worked for my dad. He owned an office supply store, and I worked in the warehouse for almost a year and couldn't stand it and said, I've got to go be a musician somewhere. I've got to sing somehow. And I moved to California with the idea of becoming a studio singer, like a background singer, or finding somebody who thought I sang as good as I thought I sang and would do a contract with me or something. So I went out there, sang at a big church because of the choir director. He was very famous in the Southern California area. His name was Jack Coleman. Passed away many years ago, but Jack was a freelance producer, songwriter, choral conductor, just an amazing man. And he put me in a group called The Number of Grace. There were 7 of us, and we traveled all over the Southern California area doing concerts and stuff like that. But we also did a lot of background vocal stuff for commercials. So yeah, I did have some enjoyment as a professional vocalist. I ended up getting married to a woman that I had met out there, and she had grown up in Boulder, and she had just gotten through her divorce when we met and eventually got married, but she just wanted to go home to Boulder. And that's how I had that connection to Boulder. I started roofing. It's the job I ended up with. Hated that because I was freezing in the winter and burning up in the summer on these roofs.
Sounds about right.
And started looking for another job. And this is obviously pre-computers. So how you found another job was you looked in the paper, and there was classified ads, and Lafayette Police Department had placed an ad in the paper that they were looking for patrol officers. And long story short, I got hired out of 500 and some odd applicants. Spent 3 years in patrol, and my whole goal in being a cop was to be a detective. All my cases were child abuse, child sex assault, domestic violence, adult rape, and adult sex assault, and then runaways. It wasn't a crime to be a runaway, but I was just assigned to help locate runaways.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really enjoyed putting bad guys behind bars. Probably had a lot to do with the way I was raised. I developed a very keen interest in helping victims of domestic violence. Domestic violence became an educational springboard for me to understand how prevalent rape is within relationships. And I don't think people still to this day realize that if you've got a domestic violence situation going, if there's assault going on in the relationship, the chances that there's also rape and sex assault going on in that same relationship is probably about 100%. Although the research shows that it's at about 80%. I think a lot of that 20% that aren't talking about it don't consider it rape because they're married and they think that that's part of their marital duty.
Right.
And the other aspect of it is it's embarrassing to say, yeah, he rapes me too. I just read a lot, and I talked to people who had expertise in that area and got materials from the Minnesota Project on Domestic Violence and Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Sexual Assault, because these were huge cornerstones of that research and of that investigative industry and caregiving and advocacy. Pennsylvania just led the nation, Pennsylvania and Minnesota. So I did that for 15 years. After 3 years of patrol, 15 years as a detective, and decided to take early retirement and start my own training and consulting business because I had been utilized by my chief to train other agencies in those fields. His name was Leo Carrillo. I have to give a shout out to Leo. He was so active and pro-victim in domestic violence and rape cases. He was the head of the Colorado Victims' Rights Board. And what that board did was it reviewed all complaints from all departments in Colorado, regardless of what the complaint about law enforcement was. But the majority of the complaints that came in were from victims of domestic violence and rape, for officers not treating victims right. Oh. And so instead of taking punitive action, Leo's response was, let's train them right. Let's get them the education they need. And Dave, I want you to go train that agency. So he sent me all over the state of Colorado to train these different agencies that were getting complained about with regard to how they were investigating those cases. After doing that for a while, my caseload kept growing because I was out of town so much, and I'd come back to this, 10, 15 new cases on my desk. And I said, Leo, you've either got to stop sending me around the state to train or stop giving me new cases and let me just train. He goes, no, you're doing great, Dave. Just keep doing what you're doing. Do both.
You're fine.
So I did. I think I did that for another 2 or 3 years after I complained to him. And I just said, finally, I'm quit and become a full-time trainer instructor. That's what I did. Started my own training consulting business. The Army heard about me a few years later. I got hired by the Army to be what's called a highly qualified expert and worked for the Criminal Investigative Division of the Army. I helped design and co-managed the 2-week Special Victims Unit Investigations course that was taught both there at Fort Leonard Wood in South Central Missouri, where I was stationed, but also we did that same course at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. So I was back and forth between Missouri and Georgia quite a bit. That education process for me as a highly qualified expert was more of an education for me than it was me teaching them. I got to work with some very, very intelligent, high-level psychologists, research people in the field of sex assault and rape and domestic violence issues, interpersonal violence. And that's where I got the majority of my trauma-informed education and what it meant to be trauma-informed and how the brain reacts to trauma. So I got a lot of neuroscience because I was working side by side with some amazing people, including Dr. David Lesak, Dr. Jim Hopper, Dr. Kim Lonsway from the End Violence Against Women International organization, which trains law enforcement. There are several others that I worked with. I valued that education after I finished my assignment as a highly qualified expert, which is a 5-year appointment with a 1-year renewal period if you're doing well. And I did get renewed. It was an honor. But when those 6 years were up, I left Fort Leonard Wood, moved back to southern Utah, and was convinced to start a podcast and do my training from that aspect and try and help people become trauma informed and also to help people understand the neuroscience of the brain, what our brains do when we go through such severe trauma. The worst trauma I think that humans can endure is rape. And I know you guys can speak to that. I think it's worse than losing a loved one. I think it's worse than combat. I think it's worse than pretty much anything that we can endure, because all of those things that I just mentioned are things that humans understand are part of life.
Mm-hmm.
But what we don't understand, what our brains don't wrap around at all, is having our personal bodies, personal spaces, personal intimacies violated in a rape situation. And I think there's research that backs up that if you encounter a person who's experienced all kinds of traumas, like combat, like a death of a child, for instance, if they lost an infant right after birth or something like that, and they were also raped, and you ask those people to rate which of those traumas was the worst, the majority of them list the rape at the top.
Oh, yeah.
Not everybody, and I'm not saying it is the worst thing. I'm not saying that exclusively. I'm saying that it's predominantly considered probably the worst thing that can happen to a human. And you alluded to that too, Shannon, in how it froze you and prevented you from being an athlete.
Yeah. I frequently think that it would be easier to go through my dad dying again than go through being assaulted in the court case and going through all of that. You had just said that people tend to, if you were to rate your traumas on a scale, that being raped is one of the top ones. And a lot of times I justify things like, oh, I was so young when my dad died, so maybe it would be different. But with my trauma knowledge that I have, and when I say trauma knowledge, I mean all of my different experiences, I think that being raped was far worse than losing my dad.
I also feel like the responses you get from other people is so vastly different, because if you have a loved one that dies, everyone rallies around you. We're going to help you get through this. Maybe it's annoying that you have so much support. Maybe you want all those people to get away. But then when you go through something like rape or sexual assault, it is so personal and so intimate that you're not going to be telling all these people, most likely. And so you're not going to have that same sort of understanding and support. And so it's just a trauma that society doesn't understand, how we understand death. And so it's just a really weird thing that it's almost like so hard to compare it because of how society responds to it. When someone in your family dies, no one's going to come up to you and be like, you're lying. What's wrong with you?
Right.
Like, this is your fault. No one's going to have that response. But then when you say, oh, I've been raped, it's totally different. People are going to attack you and not support you. And that's terrifying to know that's even an option that could happen.
There are two major components of being raped that experts and victims and survivors alike agree on as being the most re-traumatizing of the experience of being raped. Those two things are not being believed, which you just mentioned, and being blamed for your own rape. And I know you guys can relate to that. Should we talk about that a little bit?
We can go there.
Yeah, let's go there.
Let's talk about being blamed for your own rape. Either one of you.
I think Shannon can probably speak to this better than I can.
Well, I don't know if it's about better, but I was actually thinking about a particular experience with a person that we both experienced blame from, and that would be my mother. When I first told my mother, it was just a few days after I'd been assaulted. I had already had a therapy appointment set up just because I was going to therapy every week, and it just so happened that I had been assaulted a few days prior, so it was quite timely. And when I told my therapist, she said, "You have to tell your mother. And you need to tell your mother because you're going to be experiencing a long list of side effects, and your mom has to know." And so we scheduled another appointment for my mom to be there and for me to be there and my therapist to be there to have a sort of mediator. And I say, "Mom, I was raped." And I start going through what happened, and I just word vomit everything that happened. And the first thing she said is, "You were drinking?" Not, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh, are you okay? I love you." Just, "You were drinking?" That was the immediate, "This is exactly why I didn't want to tell you, because I knew you were going to focus on the wrong thing." And I just remember being so confused about, confused and validated in the same point of, I knew she would react that way because my mother has a history of not responding in the correct quote unquote way. But at the same time, just so horrible of like, I can't believe that you're not coming over here to give me a hug or anything like that. I do have to note that there were a lot of things that she did a lot better later on. She learned she had never experienced anything like this, but to have the first quote unquote real adult that I had told, who was my mother, respond with, "You were drinking." And then if you hadn't drank, then maybe this wouldn't have happened to you, which was something she told me a couple weeks later. I mean, made me want to go back into my shell.
Made you want to drink some more.
Which I did. Yes, exactly. Precisely.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to make a joke. It's a common response.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah. It's a very common response. This is like kind of a tangent, but I want to add this in because I think that the response Shannon's mom had is not a unique response. We see that all the time, and especially from older generations that didn't talk about these things. I think that your mom, Shannon, has come a really long way since then.
yeah.
And I think like one of the moments that I learned that was it was over the summer, and we were all in Tahoe. It was me, Shannon, my mom, my dad, and then Shannon's mom. And we were at dinner, like at a restaurant, and my dad was talking about one of his father's colleagues or something like that, and how like great of a guy he was, and how he was such an asset to my grandfather and all this stuff. And then Shannon's mom is like, "Oh, like he was a predator towards me."
Yeah.
She came out and said it, which was very courageous, and I really respected her for that. But then my dad's response was, "Oh, what are you talking? Like, he was such a nice guy. Like, he was so great to me." And I was like, "Well,
Yeah.
you were a like white man in America, and like just because you had this great experience with him doesn't mean he wasn't capable of being a predator and doing disgusting things to like a 14-year-old girl, which your mom was at the time."
Yeah. She used to
And so
bend
I stood up
over.
for her, and I was like, "Dad, that's bullshit. Like, a lot of murderers are super nice to people, but then they could turn around and murder people. And it's the same thing with rapists and predators. And that's exactly what happened in this case." And so I stood up for her. And I remember, I think after that trip, getting a text from Shannon's mom just really thanking me for standing up for her and for having her back in that situation. It's been a journey with your mom, Shannon, obviously, because she did place a lot of blame on me as well, because I didn't speak up after it happened to me. And then Shannon's assault was after mine, and it was with the same person that assaulted me. And so she put a lot of blame on me for that. But I think that as we've had conversations with her, and as she has learned, and as she has had the ability to open up about her own experiences, she's just been way more informed and has learned way more about how to respond to all these different things, which can sometimes feel impossible to respond to. It's been definitely a journey with your mom, but she's definitely made a lot of headway.
Thank you. I'm sure my mom would love to hear that. But I also like to note that I think parents, especially parents of daughters, are so afraid of something like this happening to their child. And then when it does happen, I think a lot of times they realize, oh, I couldn't protect them from everything. This is like the one thing that I really didn't want to happen, and it happened. And so for a mom to be able to blame you or somebody else in our circle who had also been assaulted before I was assaulted by the same guy, it would be much easier for her to do that than to try to take on that blame, when in reality, it's not her fault. It's not my fault. It's not your fault. It's the perpetrator's fault. But for a parent, they might feel like they've failed. And so that's the only thing that they know what to resort to, is blaming other people.
Spot on. Absolutely. We could talk about just the victim blaming aspect of rape and sex assault the rest of the day and into tomorrow easily, because it is such a huge aspect of what I call rape culture.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about rape culture, because my issue with victim blaming and rape culture is the aspect of rape and sex assault is different than any other crime. I'm not talking about, yes, it's a horrible thing to do to another person, but it's also a crime. Okay. And
Right.
so let's think about it in the category of where it is in the criminal justice system. It's a felony. Most societies around the world consider rape a serious felony, but yet there is a completely different mindset when the judicial system and our society as a whole look at rape and that blame the victim. And we treat rape differently than any other crime. Can you think of one other crime where the victims get blamed as much as they do with rape? There's two situations as a former detective that come to mind where I heard a lot of victim blaming. One was car trespass. Well, if you had locked your car, right? Which is a fallacy, because I investigated umpteen car trespass cases where multiple cars in a, for instance, apartment complex parking lot parked right next to each other had many cars that were locked, and the offender just broke the window. So no, just locking your car doesn't keep your car safe from being trespassed. The other is burglary. Well, if you'd locked your windows and your doors, or if you'd had an alarm system, this wouldn't have happened. Again, total fallacy.
Okay.
But when it comes to rape and sex assault, you don't hear the pushback from blaming a victim like you do in those other two cases, which are easily pointed out as the fallacy of victim blaming. No, it's not the victim's fault, but it seems to stick so much more with rape and sex assault. And we don't do that with any other crime. Do you have a theory on why?
In this society, we trust men more than we trust women, especially when they're men in power. And we would rather disprove and not believe female victims specifically. Obviously, there are nuances and there's a lot going on in this realm, but just when I'm focusing on male on female rape, we live in a society that we villainize women because of our emotions, because of our quote unquote need for attention. And so there's that aspect of it. And I just think that as a society, we would rather believe men, especially men in power, than take the time to believe survivors, especially because if we believe survivors, then we have to acknowledge the fact there's a problem. And there's a problem within our government, and there's a problem within our judicial system, and all these different things. And people like to live under a rock and be ignorant as fuck.
Absolutely. I'm going to throw another ingredient into that batter that you just mentioned, Lauren, and say that I have a firm theory, belief system that what we're talking about here in terms of victim blaming and not believing victims, which are the two big, like I said, issues of re-victimizing rape and sex assault victims, is that this issue of rape and sex assault goes back millennia to the beginning of time, to the beginning of recorded human history. And very, very little has changed in terms of how society and culture, different cultures, including many others than our American society and culture, victim blame and disparage and minimize and marginalize women.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's in our DNA. It's like a default. Blame the victim. Don't believe the victim. Give credit where credit is due to the perpetrator. It was a misunderstanding. It was regret sex. That's why she's reporting it as a rape. Now she regrets that she had sex in the first place. All of the things that you hear about in today's culture have existed since recorded history beginning.
Right.
And I really think we have a huge road to hoe in terms of how we fix that.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, it's also so many aspects of that are just ingrained in how we grow up too, especially as girls turning into women. And you go to school and you have a dress code that's like you can't show your shoulders, or you can't wear like a skirt that's above your knees or whatever it might be. And then we learn that it's our fault if men sexualize us,
Right.
and it's our fault if they're looking at us, instead of just teaching boys that that's not okay to do and teaching them how to have like some sort of self-control. And so there's just always been this responsibility on young women to cover up because it's mandated by their school, or to whatever it might be, like just this idea that women are supposed to satisfy men's needs and not the other way around, or just all these things that we are taught growing up in society, and then they just build and build and build and build and then all intertwine into this rape culture. I think that's something that we haven't seen really change. All these dress codes and things like that still exist in schools, and it's just something that doesn't seem to go away.
You're reminding me of a story. Back in the day, for myself, when I was attending school in person and not online yet, we had a dress code, and it was a pretty strict dress code. And there was a semester where girls were getting dress coded. 50% of the women in our class, in our whole grade, were getting dress coded. And it was specifically for spaghetti straps or your shorts being too short. And I remember it was second semester. And so, it's warm outside, Albuquerque, New Mexico, it's hot. And the person who was dress coding all of these girls was this like 62-year-old man. Wish I could remember his name. We'll just call him Mr. D right now. He literally was dress coding all of these women. We're all upset. We're all specifically wearing shorter shorts because we're angry. Well, he can't dress code the whole grade. Yeah, he could. He was doing that. One day, there was this girl named Ella, and she says, I'm going to go talk to Mr. D because how do you think he's dress coding us? What do you think he's having to do to get to that point to dress code us? And we're like, oh, Ella, what a great idea. I've never even thought about that. So she stomped her little butt into his room, into his office, and all of us girls were standing outside. And she said, Mr. D, I would like you to walk us through exactly how you dress code girls. And he says, well, I first need to figure out the length of their shorts. And she said, well, Mr. D, how do you do that? He says, well, I'm looking at their thighs. Remember, we're freshmen in high school. So what are we, like 13, 14-year-old girls? First, I'm looking at their thigh. Oh, you're looking at their thigh. Well, how far up their thigh are you looking? Well, I have to look up as short as the shorts are. And he's just, blatantly, it's this 60-year-old man looking at all these girls in basically a very inappropriate way is what it came down to. And we all were cheering and being really aggressive about it, and we all got in trouble. But ultimately, it resulted in them making it so only female teachers could dress code females, and then vice versa for men. Which obviously doesn't fully solve the problem. But I remember it was just so blatantly obvious that this older man was looking at very young girls' body parts really up close. And it was very interesting.
With an excuse, a pretense excuse of doing what he was doing. Absolutely. So rape culture, in my mind.
I have a question for you two. How do you feel about rape jokes in the context of you making them, other people making them, comedians making them? What do you think?
Lauren, I have an answer, but I want to hear yours.
I think that this is actually a complicated question because it's really interesting when you listen or like you're watching stand-up comedy and things like that, and a lot of dark jokes are made and they make fun of a lot of different issues that plague humanity in different ways. And that's part of the reason why it's funny. You create humor out of something really terrible. And that's something that like me and Shannon have done a lot of, especially as we've gone through our different traumas, is that we find the humor that's in it. And we just use that to survive. I think that when comedians go up on stage and they're making really dark jokes about their sister that died or whatever it might be, it can be really funny. I think the issue I have with rape jokes is that there's already so much ignorance when it comes to the topic of rape. And there's so much misunderstanding. When you go up and you make a joke about death, people have an understanding of death and what that means to people and how that impacts people. But when you go up and you make a joke about rape, there just isn't that level of understanding. Even if you're someone who has experienced it yourself, like there's just not enough conversations about it to shed this light on it. And so it almost feels like super ignorant to make rape jokes because of just how taboo and closed off it is. And I don't know, like it's definitely one of those things where like I can handle dark humor, but I do have a problem with it. I'm not like specifically sure why, but maybe it just feels like we're making jokes about something, but then we can't even have real conversations about it.
But we've made jokes about it. That's why I'm like, well, I don't want to answer this question necessarily, though. I want to hear your guys' opinions. But sorry, I spoke too soon.
But Shannon, you and I are making like jokes about our own experiences to ourselves and to each other.
Well, and then uploading it to the internet, though.
I think there's levels of it, though. You know what I mean? There are definitely levels of rape jokes, for sure.
True. Very true. Dave, what do you think?
Well, like Lauren said, I think it's a very complicated question. And to hear you guys say and admit, and I've heard it myself on your podcast where you joke about rape among yourselves, about yourselves, your own rapes. And yes, you're right, Shannon, those do go out to the world. But I think it does something psychologically different when two victims among themselves and on a show that talks about the horrors and atrocities of rape and sex assault, it's understood that when you start joking about it, it's a coping mechanism. It's an option that you take in order to really obtain some sort of therapeutic value out of it. When you asked the question, Shannon, my mind immediately went to the professional stand-up comedian or even the semi-professional, somebody that does it periodically, who is making that type of joke. I get tremendously offended and upset, probably because of my personal experience with rape and sex assault.
Right.
In addition to my dad making fun of me as I was growing up through his emotional abuse to me and seeing the impact it had on me, he would rub my nose, as a figure of speech, into whatever it was that was upsetting me based on what he was doing to emotionally traumatize me. He recognized when I was upset, and he'd make it worse by zeroing in on that and amplifying it. When a stand-up does it on a stage, the reason I get so upset, as I mentioned, this probably had to do with some of that, but also because of my professional background as an investigator, a law enforcement official who is trying to help victims and survivors, number one, tell their story to begin with in such a way that I can obtain enough evidence to hopefully take action against the perpetrator, but then also to get enough evidence to bring into court. When people start joking about that from a professional capacity, I think, oh man, how uneducated they really are. Even if they are victims themselves of rape or sexual assault and are using that as a platform for their own therapy, it just doesn't ring true to me as a appropriate way to get a laugh. To me, there's nothing funny about a stand-up comedian talking in dark and attempted humorous ways about something so devastating and so difficult. And it, in my mind, propagates the rape culture.
Rape culture.
Yeah. Well, like, sorry. Oh, I was just going to say, Dave, when you were talking, it kind of like helped me get to my conclusion of it. Society already thinks that rape is a joke.
Mm-hmm.
Don't turn it into more of a joke.
Yeah.
You know? Like, I think that's why it pisses me off.
Yeah. It exacerbates an already existing horrific problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think you guys explained it really well, but we got a comment one time and it was all caps. I think it was on Lauren's sexual assault story episode. And the comment was, "How dare you laugh about this? Rape is a serious thing." I didn't go back and listen to the episode because it's up, it's done now. And I've obviously seen it many times through editing, but I remember like my first thought was, oh God, my worst fear was coming alive of people thinking that we're not taking this seriously. But then I had to remind myself, like, okay, we started the podcast because we wanted to be able to have candid conversations about this. And if we're laughing about other stuff, it's not to take away the seriousness of it, but because the laughing, I think, is combined with the true core of what is actually going on. And we do talk about it in a serious way as well. I think that that's kind of what makes it okay, is that it's done in tandem, maybe.
Yeah, you're like not making a joke about the act of rape. We make jokes surrounding our experiences so we can get through it. That's also the difference there, too. And it's also just a way to get through the conversation. We've talked about this stuff so much, but like it's still sometimes uncomfortable to go relive your own experiences. So yeah, you throw a giggle in there. I mean, I giggled, and I'm saying giggle for a reason, okay? Because it wasn't like a laugh. Like when I told my dad what happened to me, I was so uncomfortable that I was sitting on my couch giggling because that was the only way I could think to get through it. Like,
Yeah, I
that was
cannot.
it.
Absolutely. I can't tell you how many times investigators that I've worked with and that I've seen and I've observed or even talked to about their experiences have said something along these lines. Well, when she was telling me as an investigator about her rape, she kept laughing about it. She giggled all the way through it. She laughed about it. She was smiling. She was no big deal almost. And if it really had happened, this is their logic, if it really had happened, they wouldn't be laughing about it. Well, that's just a complete misunderstanding of human psychological response for some people to trauma. People laugh about being in an airplane crash. People laugh about being in a car crash. People laugh about dead baby jokes all the time, right?
Oh, yeah.
Those were a big thing back when I was in college. Everybody told dead baby jokes. Not funny to me. I don't know. Some people think they're funny, but it's just, to me, there's limits. And I think what probably makes me say not funny and there's limit is because I understand quite a bit about why our brains do what the brains do. It's a neurological phenomenon. It's a psychological, neurological, psychophysiological response to trauma. And it's a wall. It's a coping mechanism. It's a way of dealing with something that's extremely painful. You've heard the expression, I'm laughing because it hurts too much to cry.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if anyone, this is going
And
to sound
Lauren's
so
laughing.
This is gonna sound so bad, but it's like in college and like high school and stuff, it can be really hard to get out of classes. They make it impossible for you to like miss a class. And I'm sure, I don't know. I don't know if Shannon's done this, but like you like tell a lie. Like you say something bad happened so that like you can get out of a class, okay? And you're not going to walk into your professor and start laughing when you're telling them this lie to get out of a class. You're probably going to be so solemn and so uncomfortable and sad. You know what I mean? And if someone was lying about getting assaulted, you really think that they would be sitting there laughing? No, they would be garnering all their acting abilities to act as sad as they possibly can, which obviously when people tell the stories, like sometimes they are very, very sad. Of course, of course. They're not going to be sitting there laughing.
Yeah.
Like that is an indicator of like telling the truth because you're just so deeply uncomfortable and so actually sad that there's no other option than to laugh, which obviously this is a general statement. Not everyone acts that way when they tell their stories, but for me and Shannon, that's kind of just how it was and how it felt.
That's how we roll.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm curious, Dave, if you can tell us a bit about kind of the long-term impacts of sexual trauma. I'm definitely asking for myself and not a friend. um, but I've noticed that recently I've become significantly more anxious, and just a lot of things that I've been experiencing in my personal life have been like, whoa, I definitely need to get back into therapy. And I don't know if it's connected to my sexual trauma or if it's just me growing up and my frontal lobe developing. So yeah, what could you tell us about the long-term impacts of sexual trauma in the brain?
How much time do you have?
Well,
So
I guess, yeah, do the best that you can.
it's a phenomenally good question. It's a phenomenally difficult question to answer, but there is some recent research, and I would guess that you've probably heard about it because it hit the news, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, even though the research itself is probably 10 years old. It took a while for it to surface and make its way through social media and major media. And that research is that rape and sex assault has such a deep impact on the human psyche that it impacts our interpersonal relationships. It impacts our marital relationships, which are the interpersonal relationships. It impacts our work product. It impacts our ability to make a good income. It impacts our physical health, obviously impacts our mental health. To what degree? That all depends upon the individual. And you just brought up a very interesting aspect of all of that is why right now am I feeling a lot more anxiety than I was maybe 6 months ago or a year ago about the rape? Why is the rape kind of center in my mind almost maybe to the same extent it was shortly after it happened? Well, it varies from person to person as to why, but it goes to show that the way our cognitive and emotional functioning works is kind of like ocean waves. It ebbs and flows. And what those, I don't like the word triggers, but what those activators are can vary immensely. As you just mentioned, you said, well, I don't know if it's because of some of the stuff I'm going through personally right now. I don't know if it's because of work. I don't know if it's because my studies are bugging me and I'm already feeling anxiety. But when those tiny little memories come to mind about my rape or sex assault, all of a sudden they seem amplified and they seem center focus and they seem very, very intrusive and obsessive in the way I'm thinking right now. I know there's a science to it because that's what I'm referring to in this research. But even scientists and psychologists that study this stuff, as I just mentioned, don't know what those activators are. And it's so individual and so unique for each person. As you know, there are some people who maybe have been raped, sometimes even in some pretty atrocious, physically harmful ways that seem to just float through it. Right? It doesn't seem to bother them. They say, yeah, I was raped and it was horrible and I was in the hospital and I went through a little bit of therapy. I'm fine now. And they may actually be telling the truth. They might be fine and it may not ever impose itself into their daily thought function at all, their cognitive functioning and their ability to perform in whatever aspect they're performing in, work, relationships, health. Yet there are others who maybe experienced what most people would consider a minor sexual assault of being slapped on the butt by some guy that was riding by on a bicycle. And they go into emotional breakdown. They curl up on the floor in a fetal position. They cannot function, as you were referring to and saying you were raped. You couldn't even skate anymore. Well, some people do that from just what others would consider a minor sex assault. But to them, because of where they were cognitively, what their education level is, what their sophistication level is, what their emotional mindset was when it happened. There's so many varying factors that it can have this devastating impact. I wish I had a really good answer for you. But I think the answer is understand that there is no good answer, but that it's normal to feel the way you're feeling. You're one of millions of people who might be feeling the same exact way at any given moment because of what you experienced. An important aspect to look at this too is that if you take all of the anxiety that you have and that maybe you're referring to as we talk about this very topic and eliminate the fact that you were raped, would you still be feeling the same level of anxiety and stress and possibly side effects of physical illness and fatigue and shutdown? And well, very possibly, yes. It may have absolutely nothing to do with the fact that you experienced a rape. But my theory is that if you are feeling all of those anxieties and there is just that small activator of some type that intrudes itself into the neural paths of that anxiety that has anything to do with your rape, it's going to exacerbate it and amplify it exponentially. It kind of takes over your brain. Because of what we talked about before. Rape is so personal. Rape is so devastating. Rape impacts every single cell in our body. Well, how do you know that, Dave? Well, because when you're raped, what our brain does in trauma and how the brain functions with the limbic system, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, all those really intricate internal, way deep down inside of the brain limbic system parts react. They call it the fear cascade. Our bodies just become awash in these hormones that we have absolutely no control over. It's all automatic. It's all biologically impossible to control. Those same chemicals are released when we have a minor stress, like we can't find our keys and we're late for an appointment, as when we're raped. The difference is the amount of those chemicals that flush through our bodies. But when those chemicals are released, where do they go? Well, they start in areas of your brain like the pituitary gland. They come from even your thyroid gland. They come from all sorts of places where hormones are excreted throughout our body. And where do they go? Into the bloodstream. And what happens when they go into our bloodstream? Our blood circulates through our entire body. So even the smallest fraction of your left toenail experiences a level of those chemicals. So that's why I say it impacts every cell in your body, because our blood system supplies every cell in our body. And when you think about it that way, it makes a whole lot more sense as to why we have something called the body keeps the score, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Our bodies psychophysiologically have memory of especially traumatic experiences. It's
Thank you.
impossible to avoid that. It's what's going on physically. And obviously, those physical responses have an emotional impact in most people. Did that answer your question at all? Just
Yeah.
probably made it more complicated.
Well, it is complicated. It's also a reminder that even if your conscious mind isn't thinking about the traumas you've been through, that doesn't mean your body isn't.
That's absolutely right.
I think it's so easy if you're having a bad day or feeling really anxious or depressed or whatever it might be, it's so easy to try to find a single reason why.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we can't, it's annoying because we're like, then what's wrong with me? Why am I in such a bad mood today? Nothing bad happened to me. Nothing inconvenient happened. Why am I in such a bad mood? And you have to remind yourself that that anxiety is coming from places within our body, from things that have just happened to us over our lives. It's important to give yourself grace in that too, because that's also like a way you heal. If you just try to pinpoint random reasons for why you can be in a bad mood, you're kind of just in this lost goose chase, kind of.
Right. One of the things that really helps that and helps us deal with our anxiety and overwhelming feelings is having someone who understands what we've been through, who knows maybe not a lot, but just something about human trauma and the psychophysiological responses of the brain and the neuroscience of the brain, just even a small amount of knowledge, who is willing to, even if it's just figuratively, wrap their arms around you and say, it's okay. It's normal. You're going to be all right. I am here with you. I'm holding you, even if it is just figuratively. I'm here for you. Use me to help you. Help me help you get through this. Tell me what I can do. Help me help you alleviate some of what you're feeling. And the research shows that too has a tremendous impact on our recovery rate and our recovery amount. Not just how fast we recover, but to what extent that recovery occurs. And so I just want to wrap my arms around both of you right now.
Thanks, Dave.
First of all, and tell you I am really sorry for the experiences that you both lived through in your rape and sex assault experiences. I'm so terribly sorry that that happened to you. I empathize with you, and I really do have a deep understanding of what that feels like to you. And I really have a deep understanding of why people joke about it, including listening to you guys talk about it. And I'm thankful that you do. And I'm thankful that you talk about it, because others need to hear that you respond to your trauma that way, because they may be doing the same thing and then have guilt feelings about it, have shame about it. And I don't want them to. I want them to know that's normal. I'm sorry for what happened, but thank you for sharing what you've been through and how that process works, what that healing looks like. It's really, truly a pleasure, which is a weird word to apply to rape and sex assault podcasts. It's a pleasure to listen to your podcast.
Oh, thank you, Dave. Thanks for all that you do. And you're so calming. I feel like you could do a meditation podcast and I would listen to that too. I feel like at ease right now.
Don't fall asleep.
Not asleep, just like very calm.
Yeah, anxiety is lower.
Yeah.
I'm happy to hear that. I'm glad that it has that effect on you.
I don't have any additional questions off the top of my head. I know that we could talk for a really long time.
I throw this out a lot with my guests, and I know I'm a guest on your show, but I really am feeling honored that you are guests on my show. And I'm going to throw this out to you too, and that is that we need to do this again. I think it would be an amazing thing if we could periodically, maybe not on a schedule. I've tried that before with some guests. It's really hard to manage. But if we could just stay in touch with each other on a personal basis, but also on this business basis of doing podcasts, and keep it in our minds that we should devote another episode in the not too distant future and several more, maybe even after that. I just think it's a beneficial, educational, and helpful process.
Yeah, I think we both agree with that for sure.
100%. Same time next week.
If you don't have a meeting.
I don't know, actually. I have to look at the calendar, but no, this has been so awesome. I feel like, maybe this is a little out there, but I feel like a lot of people our age or our generation, we're not really friends with people of different ages. Whereas I feel like maybe your generation, you were friends with maybe younger people, older people, and that was more normal. And I would like to have more friends of diverse ages. And so I'm happy to call you a friend and to be on your show. And I think I speak for Lauren too when I say that. And this has been lovely.
It's an honor to hear you say that. It really is. It's fuel to my soul. It's a privilege that you would spend this kind of time with an old guy. Thank you, guys. This has been amazing.
Yeah, thank you, Dave.
Thank you, guys, for spending this time with me, letting me be on your show, and for being on mine.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, we appreciate you taking the time as well.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This has been an exceptional episode, and I'm truly grateful to have had the opportunity to share this time with Shannon and Lauren. It's been a thrill to be hosted by these two incredible women who in turn graciously opened up about their experiences and insights. I can't thank them enough for this remarkable opportunity, which has not only enriched this episode, but also enlightened me personally. These two powerful women have been a delight to get to know better. Through our conversation, we've shared thoughts, opinions, and understandings, and I hope that you, the listener, have found the same sense of connection and inspiration that I did. As always, if you or someone you know is in need of support, remember that you are not alone. I encourage you to reach out and speak up. If you've listened to this podcast at all in the past, you know that your voice is valuable and your story matters. I want to encourage all of you to help bring justice to victims and survivors. One of the best ways to do this is to start by believing when a victim or survivor reaches out to tell their story, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault, and because it's time that we start to normalize these conversations in order to reduce the impact of rape culture in our society. Please leave me a 5-star rating on this podcast platform and email me a note of encouragement and support. Your emails are fuel to my soul in keeping this podcast going. My email address is in the episode notes, and I'd truly appreciate hearing from you. Thank you again for being here, and be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a new and impactful episode right here on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. We'll see you next week.